So welcome everyone to this Foray Digital special event, launching and discussing Cups of Nunchai with Alana Hunt and Sanjay Kak in conversation with Jasmine Stevens. So my name is Conjur Karis, and I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners on the land of which I'm broadcasting, the Gadigal People of the Eora Nation. And I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. So this event will be one of our final Foray Digital commissions for 2020. So Foray Digital is an online platform for commissioned projects by Australian artists. As part of our commitment to fostering excellence and innovation, Foray Digital is a space for creative and academic exploration, giving artists, writers, academics and professionals the opportunity to experiment and investigate concepts and ideas outside of the exhibition and sort of published journal formats. So tonight we'll be discussing Cups of Nunchai in a webinar format. So just a few guidelines before we start. You can everyone open the chat window if you'd like and introduce yourself if you'd want to. And yeah, so just letting you know that we are recording this discussion. So for people who aren't here, if you're not happy being recorded, you can sort of choose to leave the meeting if you'd like, or not participate, just your personal preference, or turn off your video and just listen. So all the attendees will be on mute during the discussion so we can better hear the speakers. If you're having any technical issues with hearing or have a question for Foray, just alert me in the chat box. If you'd like to ask a question to all the panelists, and in this session you are encouraged to do so throughout the discussion, please use the Q&A button to submit your questions. So all the questions can currently be seen by all the panelists and they'll respond to it in their time. Now I'd like to introduce Jasmine Stevens, who will be our moderator for the chat. So Jasmine.
Oh, thank you, Con. Welcome everybody. I'm really delighted to be here with Con, with Sanjay and also with Alana. I'm conscious that we are gathering from all different parts. So Alana, who is a visual artist and writer, and whose book we will be launching today, is joining us from Fremantle Arts Centre on Noongar lands. And documentary filmmaker and writer Sanjay Kak is speaking to us from New Delhi. Some of you will know of Sanjay because his recent publication, Witness, was part of Niran, Biennale of Sydney, at Campbelltown Arts Centre. This publication has been 10 years in the making. It's a book of Cups of Nunchai. It's a recording of the sharing of not only chai, but also conversations across 10 years and in many locations. We see these conversations as a growing memorial for the 118 civilian lives that were lost in the freedom protests in Kashmir in 2010. This act of memorial is ongoing and it takes many forms, as we're going to discover today. Today, it takes the form of an online conversation and the launch of a book. But as we'll discover, it's going to continue in many other ways. I'd particularly like to welcome those of you who are here with us from Kashmir. I'm also aware that we have attendees who are with us from Pakistan, from China, and from India. So wherever you are joining us, welcome, welcome. Most of these events begin with a moment to reflect on 2020. And it's been a time where there've been unexpected events, but also there's been a sense of inevitability about some of the things that have occurred. One of the things that I would like to highlight is that at the end of 2019, in India-occupied Kashmir, there was a shutdown of communications. There was a shutdown of landlines mobile phones and internet. And this is the longest shutdown to have ever occurred in a democracy. It took place over 170 days. In mid-January, earlier this year, limited services were restored. Kashmir now has some services, reduced internet speeds, but no social media. And so against that background, I feel our gathering is really, really special. So before we start to speak about the book, I'm going to call on firstly Alana and then Sanjay to provide a fuller introduction. Alana.
Thanks everyone for coming, and thank you, Jasmine, for that introduction. My name's Alana Hunt, and I make art and write. A lot of my work moves across South Asia and Kashmir specifically, and also the northwest of Australia on Mirrawong country where I live. The kind of conceptual threads that move across both these places are connected to colonization and nation states and their fragility, their violence, and their absurdity across both these things. So Cups of Nunchai, as Jasmine said, this publication is the culmination of a body of work I've been working on for over 10 years and collaborating with many other people along that period along the way. So it's kind of special to launch it as a book now. Sanjay?
Thank you all. Briefly, I'm a documentary filmmaker. I've been one for most of my working life. Some years ago, I started writing, and then at one point, I was putting together, curating a book, the one that Jasmine referred to, called Witness. It was a photo book, an ambitious photo book. And because I couldn't find a publisher in India who would take on something as difficult as that book, I decided to become a publisher. At that time, I thought perhaps we would be a single book publishing house and we would never do another one until Cups of Nunchai came to us. And in a sense, it represented precisely the kind of texture and terrain of books that we would like to explore as a publishing house, and more as we talk. Thank you.
Thank you. And perhaps you could, by way of introducing Kashmir, which is now one of the most contested and militarized zones in the world, Sanjay, could you say a little about the exhibition Witness, which was presented at Campbelltown Arts Centre earlier this year?
So I think we're going to be able to see at least one installation.
Yes, yeah. The first slide is up.
Yes. Okay. So basically, the invitation from Nirin, the Biennale of Sydney, was to kind of do an iteration of the book. And I worked together with the Itu Chaudhary Design, who had designed the book, to sort of transform but not change the way in which the book works. So what you see is a view of how the images were contained. What was on the ground was a 2-channel video that had been specifically designed for the Sydney Biennale. The book looked at a particular period of modern Kashmir history, 1986-2016, which for me, apart from being the years of conflict, were also specifically years in which photographers from Kashmir, and particularly photojournalists, had emerged as a very powerful way in which the story of Kashmir could be told. And that's what drew me to it. What drew me to the fact was that they were photographers from within Kashmir who were telling their own stories, having to find a language appropriate to tell the story in. And so it was like watching a particular form evolve literally through the conflict. And that's what the book represented, and hopefully that's what the installation at Campertown Arts Center also represents.
Oh, thank you, Sanjay. And as we look at the second image, I'd just like to acknowledge Campbelltown Arts Centre and also Niran Sydney Biennale for making the images available, and also photographer Zan Wimberley. And so, having set the scene, let's turn to Nunchai. Alana, I'd like to ask you to tell us more about this ubiquitous beverage. And as we hear about Nunchai, I'm also thinking about the words of Shuddha Sengupta from Rak's Media Collective, whom you have known since 2008. Shuddha has described the gesture of having salt tea as acting as a fulcrum.
Yeah, so, you know, Nunchai is entrenched in everyday life in Kashmir and also in Kashmiri identity. It's a beverage that's consumed morning, noon, evening. It's served to celebrate births, to celebrate marriages, and also to mourn death as well. So it's something like very common in Kashmir, and it's also a drink that I just generally, a salty drink that I was just generally really fond of from my first trip to Kashmir. I think central to consuming tea within Kashmir is also that idea of conversation and discussion in the everyday, and that kind of conviviality is something that I carried into this work. So Cups of Nunchai is not a body of work about tea per se. And as Shuddha said, it's like a fulcrum. It's a catalyst. It's it's almost the medium that provides something quite hospitable. It provides space and time, like it sets up a context through which conversations can take place. And it gives a flavor of Kashmir, you could say. So that the Nunchai became a framework for me to begin a series of conversations that unfolded over 2 years between 2010 and 2012 with 118 people, mostly in Australia. The first 2/3 took place in Australia. The last third took place in India and in Kashmir. And I used sort of the tea as a medium, almost as a way to hospitably like engage with some really difficult conversations and to build a memorial around the loss of life that took place during pro-freedom protests in 2010. Yeah.
And at this point, I'd like to invite questions or comments from everybody. But Alana, going on from that, I'd like to ask you a question. I've noted in our personal exchanges and also in some of the communications around the book that you've talked about yourself as someone listening to Kashmir. Could you tell us more about that phrase, listening to Kashmir, and how it relates to what you've been saying about Nunchai?
You know, I think the work I've produced around Kashmir, I've always been quite conscious of producing this as someone not from Kashmir. And so a lot of the process has been about me learning as well. And so I've learnt just personally a huge amount from Kashmir and from Kashmiri people as well. And there's an amazing, very kind of stimulating discourse that I've been able to be a part of, like creatively and politically. So that has definitely shaped the work. When the work sort of emerged in 2010, there was a lot of writing coming out of Kashmir at that time, like journalists writing, like of my generation, then people writing poetry, short stories. There was sort of an emergence of hip hop coming out of Kashmir that explored the conflict through MC Cash and others. I really sort of felt when I came back to Australia in the middle of 2010, people were, really more or less dying in Kashmir every day. And I was in touch with friends there via social media and email who were kind of living that out. And no one around me in Australia kind of had any idea that this stuff was going on. So I really felt this tension there and this need to sort of make some of this visible on one hand, and also to sort of capture or hold or archive the moments and the conversations that were taking place as a sort of, the cups of tea became like an absurd gesture of kind of fighting against the absurdity of the state's violence that was happening in Kashmir at that time, So yeah, but back to the idea of listening. I also think listening is something that's important, but conversing is equally important. Like my work has always sort of conversed back and forth between Kashmir and outside of Kashmir and with Kashmir and about Kashmir. So those things have moved for me.
And taking that original image, that original motif, methodology, possibility of sharing a cup of nun chai, the project has gone on to take many forms, as I mentioned in the introduction. So I am aware that the text within the book has been part of a 10-hour durational reading at the Darwin Festival. I'm also aware that the text has been serialised as part of a newspaper in Kashmir, and that paper now exists in bound volumes. So could you tell us about some of the forms that the project has taken, and perhaps speak about how those transitions have occurred?
Yeah. As I just mentioned, it was kind of a way of presenting this motif of care as well was central to it, and care in the face of, horrific violence that was being orchestrated. The work began through conversations with individuals over cups of tea. So it began in quite an intimate personal space. And I would write about these conversations from memory and take a photo of the person holding their cup of tea. These were then accumulating online on a website as that happened from 2010 onwards. And that for me was quite an important way of circulating the work within Kashmir from Australia as it was kind of unfolding. After I finished having the cups of nun chai with people 2012, there were a couple of exhibitions, and I was really wanting to find a way to circulate it. I think the ideas of circulation and distribution are really central to how I work as an artist. And I'm interested in circulating work, not just within kind of the context of art, but outside of it very much is really important to me. So I really wanted to kind of bring the work back to Kashmir and Kashmir is a context where an exhibition is not possible because of the cultural setting there of the military occupation and all of that. So, and also like exhibitions reach like a small amount of people. They're on for a short amount of time, and then they're very resource heavy, and they go away. So I started making this work really with no funding or anything. So having the cups of tea, using the internet, were really low cost things. They were just very time intensive. I'd always been very interested in newspapers within Kashmir, and we can talk a bit more about this in detail later. But the first time I went to Kashmir in 2009, I came back to Delhi with a bundle of newspapers from Kashmir because they simply reported something that was so different to the newspapers I'd been seeing within in Delhi at the time where I was living. So in 2016, Kashmir Reader, a daily newspaper, agreed to take the work on and serialize it 3 times a week. So the serialization began in June 2016 on the anniversary of Tufail Ahmed Mattu's passing. The first month it continued relatively normally, as normal as things go there. And then in July, a rebel commander named Burhan Wani was killed, and the population of Kashmir came out in mourning and also in protest. So that created a whole other kind of environment that really connected 2016 back to 2010 through the energy around those protests and also the state repression that responded to that. By October, there had been a whole lot of, the state was really repressing civil society, arresting numerous people and things like that. And by October, the newspaper itself, Kashmir Reader, had been banned. They were really reporting in very brave and profound ways, things that were not necessarily following the state's directions in what they wanted reported. So the newspaper was banned for 3 months, and it was quite an uncertain time, and the impact of that is continuing to shape the media sphere in Kashmir today. When the newspaper began reprinting, the serialization returned with it immediately in the first issue, and the journalists were really incredibly committed to continuing with the serialization. And so we actually collected all of those newspapers from that period, and I'm really interested in them, not just because they serialize my work, but because they capture an important period in Kashmir's recent history. And also the way that they also speak to ideas of media censorship as well, in terms of what we can read into those newspapers. So the newspapers themselves have traveled as kind of a bound volume, as a bit of an archive to places. I've held discussions about the work and readings from it with people. And now we've come together to produce the book with Sanjay and Yaarbal. And I think the work itself is quite a hard thing to package. Like, it's an artwork with over 50,000 words. And it's, really difficult to read that many words in an exhibition, say, or even online. So I'm very much excited about the book because it brings everything together, but it's also another form of circulation that allows the work to move into different places and to new audiences as well. And as much as the work kind of is grounded in 2010, it's had this kind of serialization in 2016. Sanjay and I have also been conscious as we're making it now as the book that it's going to be kind of circulating within 2020 and 2021 in these times that we're in now. So yeah, we'll see what that means and how that materializes.
Alana and Sanjay, what we're going to do now is actually turn to the book. I'm delighted to say that Alana and Sanjay have made a very small selection of pages from the book. And I think, Alana, that question that you pose of how to capture this accumulative ritual in the pages of a book is a very interesting question. I note that one of your participants, Lucas Arlene, is actually with us. And Lucas actually describes this project as a ritual of repetition and return. And so as we turn to the pages of the book, I'm going to invite you, Sanjay, to speak to the first slide.
Yeah, so I think that it's a good question that why would we at Yaarbal Books, who have a kind of a brief, an open brief to do many things, but why would we be interested in an Australian artist and writer's reading of Kashmir? And I think, I mean, if I can take a moment to just talk about my own engagement with, say, Kashmir in my working life. Well, then over the last decade, I've tried to, I made a long film. I edited an anthology of writings in 2010. We did the photo book. But I think that what was most remarkable about Alana's intervention was something that the quote from Berger, which is the sort of the epigraph for the book, exemplifies. And if I can just read it aloud. This is from The Shape of a Pocket by John Berger. And he says, "The sharing of pain is one of the essential preconditions for a refinding of dignity and hope. Much pain is unshareable, but the will to share pain is shareable. And from that inevitably inadequate sharing comes a resistance." And I think I was not the first person to be moved and engaged and snagged in some important ways with Alana's intervention, even when it first started appearing both online and then in the Kashmir Reader, which is that what do we try to do when there are things that trouble us? If I want the world to know about what's going on in Kashmir, then I want it to reach diverse publics. I want it to reappear in different forms. It could be a film, it could be a book, So I think that in this work, in Cups of Noon Chai, I think the gesture of empathy, empathy is of sharing. I think empathy is is not to be confused with a kind of anodyne sympathy, because I think empathy comes from the kind of understanding that Alana's writing in Cups of Noon Chai really opens up. It's a very, how should I say, it's, she knows the score, as they say. So it's a very astute, it's not simply a kind of, a bleeding heart foreigner kind of saying, oh my God, look what's happening. That has its own place, but maybe I wouldn't be interested in that kind of a response. But I think there was both a very, very deep understanding of what was going on and an engagement, but most of all, there was that will to share pain, and I think that to me is the central feature of this book, not just as a publisher, but as a reader of that material. That's how I would respond to it.
And Sanjay and Alana, we have a question from Doita Data. Thank you, Doita. And this question is, have either of you encountered a negative reaction to the project? That negativity can take many forms. The question is quite expansive, but obviously we're focusing on very much how this project drew allies and people who felt an affinity with the project. But has there been a negative response to the project that you personally have experienced?
No, not really. Not really. An earlier work I made called Paper Text Messages from Kashmir in 2009 to 2011, which consisted of handwritten paper text messages that people in Kashmir had written when SMS services had been banned. Somebody had said to a friend that this book is fabricated and that the paper text messages are not real. They haven't really been written by someone in Kashmir. But yeah, thankfully I haven't had any of that kind of negativity from the far right or something.
Yeah.
Sanjay, do you want to add?
So I think that Alana's been fortunate that because there's a kind of a whole industry of virulence whose main purpose seems to be to shut down the conversation around Kashmir. And I think that is why we need to also reinvent the ways in which we speak about it. And for me, as someone who's invested in speaking about Kashmir, I think that Alana's way of walking us through not just the present, but the past and all the the complexities that make up Kashmir. I think that also makes it a little difficult to dismiss. I think the thing about relatively open-ended, complex interventions is that you can't just say, "Oh, this is nonsense." You make it difficult. So I think as artists and as political beings, I think that is part of the challenge. How do you create work which is not easy for the critics to dismiss? I think that's very important for me.
Thank you, thank you. We're joined by Bridie Moran now. Bridie, would you take us through to the next slide, which Alana is going to speak about?
Oh, okay. So this is one of the contents pages of the book. So you'll see the phrases down the right side. They've been taken from the titles that accompanied the serialization of the work within Kashmir Reader. So when I began to serialize the work, it was almost like we were slipping an exhibition within the folds of a newspaper, right? In an environment where an exhibition of this kind wouldn't be possible. In doing that, I didn't want to impose my own kind of aesthetics or visual language too heavily into the newspaper space that already had its own way of communicating. So I really sort of left the design of it, relatively speaking, to the newspaper. And also the editors of the newspaper assigned the titles to the stories themselves, which, was a bit of a, it was a bit of a risk in a way, but it came with like a beautiful return because the titles that were given by the editors were phenomenal. And so for the contents, we've taken one word from those titles to kind of introduce the book. And they really are, for me, like a very beautiful way of kind of capturing the breadth of what the work tries to cover. I think if we can go to the next slide. Do you want me to speak a little bit about the serial?
Yes.
Yes.
Speak to the next slide.
Yeah. So the newspaper excerpt on the left is from a Kashmiri academic, Muhammad Junaid, that he wrote. So as I said, I was quite interested in newspapers, not just because of the content that they were producing, but as a something that circulated in the public sphere and to a really diverse public as well. So in bringing the stories into the newspaper and viewing that as a kind of exhibition, I was very conscious that my work was really grounded in 2010, and we were circulating it into another moment. You know, the newspapers hold the present. So I was almost bringing those memories of 2010 and all of the other histories and, you know, personal sentiments and stories that they sort of hold, juxtaposing it against whatever was happening in the present moment. So as I sort of said, a month after the serialization begun, Burhan Wani passed away, whose image you can see here. Or he didn't pass away, he was killed by the state. And his death really created a series of protests and mourning that well beyond my work brought that moment in Kashmir into direct contact with 2010, because there really hadn't been that kind of mass uprising that was seen between 2010 and 16 in those interim years. So yeah, I was also, you might want to go to the next slide. Just that's another spread from the book itself. Yeah, maybe I can keep talking a bit more about the newspaper, or we can.
No, I think what we should do is, if we ask Friday just to progress the next 5 slides slowly, then what will happen is we'll get to the final slide, which is the slide of the names. And Sanjay, if you could actually speak to that page of the book.
I'll just add one more thing too. I think the newspaper fragments really, they capture a part of Kashmir that I can't. And I felt like that was really important to bring into the book. And I think they also show the very well the content and the quality of the material that was being published within Kashmir Reader at that point in time. Sanjay, you can.
Yeah, I think we should look at the other few images. And so I think that there was something, when I want to speak a little bit about the design process, that there was something very both open and very fixed about the mandate of how this book could process, which is there were these 118 cups of noon chai, each one marked a particular death. And there were the newspapers which were not newspapers of 2010, which is what Alana was writing about, but of 2016. And those newspapers were tied to the appearance of Alana's piece in that newspaper. So it's actually a very interesting, almost a mechanical problem in terms of how do you get all of it so that the importance of sort of verisimilitude was not broken. You know, I think that's it was I think the designers had to wrestle with quite a few of those issues. You know, that how do you you know, all these points were kind of fixed. And if we see the next slide, to me, it appears both in the center of the book, and then it appears at the end of the book as a very subtle fold out. These are the names of the 118 people who were killed in 2010, with their ages, the place where they were from, and a date. And in that sense, I think that the memorialization in its most sort of apparent form is restricted here to this. There is everything else that Alana has done around it, you know, is using that moment and that death to speak about, if not 118 different things, but at least 100 different things. So yeah, I think that to me, these these black sheets that open out and list these names are very much the heart of the book, and the pivot around which they have.
And a constant kind of thought of mine was how to do justice to these people, how not to kind of tokenize their memorialization, and how not to be invasive about it as well. So I sort of did that by trying to bring together a sort of constellation of the world that shaped their lives and their death, in a way, from a distance, in a sense. Yeah.
Sanjay and Alana, I'm struck by the shifting scale throughout this whole process. I'm thinking about that quotation by the British writer John Berger from his collection of essays in 2003, The Shape of a Pocket. A pocket is a pocket of resistance in the case of that essay. And a pocket is intimate, small, and close to the body. And so as I think about this expansive project, I'm conscious that we have conversations, we have the turning of the pages of a book, which are very, very small in scale. But this is a project which is described by you as an archive of small moments, while at the same time, it's reflecting on the wider violence of colonization in Kashmir. So what have you learnt about shifting scale as artists, but also in association with remembrance? Alana.
Well, those bigger, events of colonial history, or colonization itself as it unfolds, or oppression of any kind, they shape all of our small moments as individuals. And I think it's important to illustrate those threads, and that's something that I try to do with this work, to highlight those threads between personal life and personal spaces and bigger political events and histories. The work sort of moves between personal spaces of, private, intimate spaces, and then it goes into sort of the mass media with the book and with the newspaper. And then I'm hoping that the book sits somewhere in the middle, in that it opens a space for movement and circulation of the work in a way that an exhibition doesn't, but it is something that can be engaged with intimately as well. Yeah, I think.
And Sanjay, your sense about how scale is constantly shifting in this work?
So I think that even for me personally, the challenge of representation is something that Alana has, I think, addressed quite admirably here. It's something that has confronted me as a filmmaker when I was working on a long film in Kashmir, 17 years ago or 16 years ago. And the question is that, how do you represent some things? How do you represent fear, or, how do you represent pain? And there is one way, which is through a certain kind of spectacle, and that often can be powerful and, effective. But I think that I'm personally much more interested in the more quietly persuasive ways of conveying pain and fear. I mean, for example, in a film, can you not represent uh, those things by something like a young boy being slapped by a soldier while he's waiting in a queue, or simply the act of raising a rifle butt to strike somebody? And I mean, if you were to look at it in a sort of with a sense of perspective, you would say, well, that's only a raised rifle butt, or that's just a slap. It's not. But it's the additive nature of these small elements. And here I return to Cups of Noon Chai. I think it's the cumulative nature of the work. And here scale is important. I think the scale of 118 names that are being remembered, and Alana's ability to turn each conversation into something special, to take something almost banal or quotidian and everyday, and out of that extract that one piece of almost startling insight. So I think that for me, principally, I mean, Alana is a visual artist, but principally this is a book of writing, and its achievements, I think, are writerly achievements. And that's really what drew me more than anything else to the book, because I believe that we haven't seen this kind of an engagement, and I'm really delighted that the book has taken the physical form that it has finally taken. Astonishingly, it all happened during the pandemic with, Alana in Western Australia and the designers and me in Delhi. So I think that it's amazing that we have the book with us now.
Alana, further to what you and Sanjay are saying about scale, we have a question from someone who is asking you to think in a microscopic kind of way. This person is acknowledging these wider forces that we're speaking about, but this person who is choosing to be anonymous is asking you, is there a particular instance or moment or incident that you would like to particularly highlight as being an impetus for this work?
Yeah. I've sort of made three works with and on Kashmir. One was the paper text messages from Kashmir, which emerged from the ban of prepaid mobile phones in 2009. the other was an essay that I wrote, actually published by 4A Papers. It was called A Mere Drop in the Sea of What Is, that I wrote about the visual culture that was circulating on the internet from Kashmir at a time when Kashmir was experiencing the first mass blinding in history. And I felt compelled in light of that to capture that big outpouring of visual material at that moment. Similarly, Cups of Nunchai came about because of what happened in 2010. So there's a couple of moments that come to mind. One was I was actually traveling back from Kashmir to Delhi when Tufail Ahmed Mattu, who was a 17-year-old boy, was killed by a tear gas canister. I got to Delhi and I remember a friend at my university in JNU kind of rush up to me and say someone's died in Kashmir. And I was like a bit confused why she was so exasperated, because a lot of people had died when I'd been in Kashmir the previous month. And, you know, Tufail's passing did ignite a whole series of protests, but that how I was confused about her exasperation really showed to me how quickly state violence can become normalized in a place like Kashmir. So that sort of stuck with me. And another element of this work is an attempt to move against the normalization of that kind of loss of life, to really kind of mark it and not let it become normal, you know? Another thing was back in Australia, not long after that, after an absence of a couple of years, and just watching this death toll rise and just really not knowing when it would end. And, you know, in an almost truer sense, it hasn't ended. People are still dying there. But the work definitely kind of clicked in my head when 69 people had died in Kashmir, and that had escalated quite quickly at that point in time. Yeah, so those are sort of the things that catalyzed it.
Alana and Sanjay, we have some really thoughtful questions. Madeline and Priyanka have asked very similar questions. They're thinking along the lines of the responsibility that you have with the materials that are being generated, which reside in the lived experience and the pain of the people that you are engaging with. And so, Alana, could you first speak about your sense of being a custodian of this material, potentially how you reach an agreement or come to an understanding with people you are participating with, that you will take that material and you will carry it forward. How do you reach those understandings? And some of the words that are being described here in the questions are, how do you work archivally? And after you've done that, we'll hear from Sanjay, because Priyanka would like to hear more about who you think the audience is for the book. And it's a quite nebulous and very challenging process that we have been speaking about, that process of sharing and representing pain. So, Alana, your sense of working archivally with the responsibility that entails, what does that mean?
Well, I would just say even working with the responsibility of this work, rather than kind of containing it to an archive as such, it feels a little bit broader there. As I've just seen Amjad's comment here about someone that he knew from his hometown who's on this list, and that this is life, you know, this is people's lives as much as yeah. So, you know, I have really that constant question I mentioned earlier about how to do this justice has been something that has always been sort of on my shoulder as the work has unfolded. And it's something that's, I guess, not allowed the work to rest so much or to stop, because it has not really reached a point where it's felt resolved enough to stop, you know. And in a sense, there is some life that this work takes in the various iterations and how it moves into the world. And I think that's sort of the pocket of resistance that you mentioned before. And keeping that pocket alive is probably something that's part of how I've worked with it. But the archival materials, let's keep in mind on terms of credits and how do you position yourself in this process. The archival materials, I'm just wondering, is that a reference like specifically to the newspaper or just to all the kind of material, do you think? I think like I see the work as an archive of a period as well. And so, which we've said, like it's an archive of the work itself, of personal conversations, of lived experiences, of people's sentiments, and how that's sort of wrapped in the work. And then we have the kind of newspaper serialization, which, you know, we spent a long time trying to work out which, you know, parts of each newspaper, because there were many, we should bring into the work and how they communicated with it as well. So I'm just looking at the question, what is the process of collaboration? So I think when I had the 118 cups of Nun Chai with 118 people, there were no kind of strict rules with how that was going to unfold, as long as people understood that they were participating in this memorial. I would then go, when I would get home, would write about our conversation from memory and send that to the person who I'd conversed with, and take their edits back and forth kind of until we got to a point that we were satisfied with. It's not a, each text is not a sort of straight document of the conversation. They might bring out elements of those conversation and build upon them. Yeah, so I did always run those texts past the people involved. Over the years, the stories have been edited and refined as well, before the serialization in the newspaper, and then again now. Yeah, there was one more thing I was going to say. Yeah, but I think another thing is that there are the people who I actually shared the Nun Chai with, but then there are a whole lot of other people who have worked with me on various elements of the work over the years, which have, you know, played profoundly important parts in the kind of growth and formation and circulation of the work as well.
Thank you. And Sanjay, returning to Priyanka's query about who you feel the audience for the book is, I'd like to also just draw in comments by Amjad and also by Zamin and think about not only what the book might share, what it might be able to communicate, but also perhaps you could both speak to a sense of what it might not be able to communicate. So Sanjay, potential audiences.
Yeah, I think that okay, if I'm going to come from my own work as a filmmaker, when you produce a work, you want everybody to watch it, you know. So I think that unlike say unlike making a documentary for a network where you'd be told that, you know, it must be 55 minutes long and it must have three central characters and there must, there's a kind of formula of it. And it's when you're free of those restrictions that you begin to think of everybody as a potential audience for the film. So for example, I would begin by saying that I certainly think that Kashmiris are an audience for this book. I saw a question someone had asked that, is this text all in English or the other languages? It's all in English, but I would say that a very large number of people who might want to access a book like this in Kashmir, the English language will not prove to be a problem. It will not be a restriction. So I think that for me, Kashmiris are an audience. I think people in India are an audience, an international audience is right for it. I think it would be impossible to, and not even very satisfying to think that you had someone in mind. Who would that someone be? I think we want everybody to read it. At the same time, not in the same way that somebody is writing, intentionally trying to craft a bestseller would, I think the argument that one would proffer for, and I'm speaking here on behalf of Alan, that we must present the argument in the way and in the shape that it's most coherent and real and true to us. And if it has that integrity, then I think your audience will sense that, and then, everybody will not get everything about it, but very many people will get a lot about it. And there was that question also about, like, how do you work out what kind of consent do you have with the people you have spoken to? And, these are questions that, journalists wrestle with, writers wrestle with, filmmakers, documentary filmmakers wrestle with. And even there, my response would be that ultimately it's this stance of the person who is doing the speaking, whether I'm doing it with a camera or a still camera or a notebook, that will define that relationship, and not any form of legal contract. I know this might sound a little bit like hippie talk, that when I speak to someone, I know they speak to me, and it's not bound by conventional notions of have we worked out what this relationship is. It's an interaction in the truest sense of the word. And yes, I am saying, yes, I'm going to put this in a film, or I'm going to put this in a book, or I'm going to put it in a piece of writing. And, Alana mentioned that she had the opportunity of going back to most of the people she had spoken to. Very often you don't have that option. Does that make it less ethical? I don't think so, So yeah, I'm moving across to the third thing that had come up in one of the questions was about how does the book speak the present. And I think it speaks very sharply to the present, because the present, Jasmine referred to last year, August 2019, when Kashmir was shut down, and a very important set of legal provisions that provided some semblance of protection and special rights to the people of Kashmir were arbitrarily sort of taken away. And since then, the abiding feeling coming out of Kashmir is a silence. And it's not, as one of the contributors to Cups of Noon Chai, Parvez Bukhari, points out, it's not the silence of defeat. It's people are thinking. And in a moment like that, I think that a book like this, which walks you through 2010 and 2016, and also allows you to share in how the world can possibly view you. There's in that sharing, which is where we began this conversation with John Berger's quote. I think that it's that which makes it critical. In that silence that Kashmir has been under for the last 15 months, this act of empathy will be read, I think, with a great deal of relief.
Thank you. And I note that Bridie from 4A, in terms of thinking about audiences, has reminded us that the article you wrote for 4A papers, Alana, was quoted in the Australian Parliament and entered Hansard. And so would you like to briefly tell us about that in relationship to this idea of audiences?
Yeah, actually, I think it was the Greens Senator Lee Rhiannon who gave a speech about Kashmir in the Australian Parliament not long after that article had been published, and portions of the article appeared in her speech. And I actually learnt about that when Sanjay forwarded a article to me with in a newspaper in I think it was an Indian newspaper. There was a heading that Australian politician speaks about Kashmir or something, and we looked into it. And so yeah, that was I'm really interested in that kind of stuff as an artist, in how your work can move beyond you and sort of beyond the conventional sort of confines of the art world as well. Yeah, and also just to kind of build on what Sanjay was saying too, I think we've been really lucky enough to have funding to produce this book, but the majority of the work has unfolded over many years without funding, and that has given it, in a sense, the kind of it's given it restrictions as well, but it's given it the kind of freedom that Sanjay mentioned there, where you're not forced to fit it into a box, and it's allowed the work to sort of brew and unfold over time. And that's been something that I've sometimes struggled with and put pressure on myself for things taking too long or something, but also learnt to trust that that things do take time, and that's okay.
And Alana, picking up on that idea of freedom, of not fitting into a box, we have Sneha Raghavan, who has raised this question, which follows on from Scale Again. This idea that the way that you and Sanjay are working operates as a memorial, but at the same time surpasses the burden of monumentality. And the burden of monumentality and the past, present, and future role of memorials in a much more massive sense is something that we've thought a lot about this year. So what's your response to this idea that the way you're working might surpass the burden of monumentality?
Well,
you've mentioned, for example, obviously in a durational sense, in a spatial sense, we're not talking about something that's, you know, fixed, that's X marks the spot.
yeah. I think like one thing is the work over the years has been responsive, you know, it's not stable. It's been fluid and responsive throughout this time to different things, and this latest iteration of it as a book is also, you know, we've been responsive as we've been making it to this moment. But you know, one thing is also on like a practical level, like not having the resources to create a giant monument. So that thinking is not something in my mind. So I'm thinking, how can I do these things? How can I, you know, make this work accessible? Something that's within my reach is to use the internet. How can I bring this to Kashmir? The newspapers became an avenue for that. So, you know, also, I guess I like the idea, which we've come back to a few times, but that idea of the pocket, of not needing a huge monument, but really kind of nurturing that pocket and getting those things to come out. Sneha, I hope that put in another question if you want to probe that further.
I certainly love the idea of not only the circulation of this work, but its portability. So
yeah, I think that is important to me. Like another thing, as we were making the book, I didn't want this to be like a sort of a kind of art book in a way. I wanted it to almost become like an undercover, like an artwork undercover as a novel almost, that it's not a book that needs to sit on a coffee table. It's a book that people can put in their backpack and carry around somewhere. You know, I want it to have that movement and that accessibility in the everyday. And that was something we really worked with the designers on.
Everyone, Sanjay, Alana and I have been thinking about the question of evidence. In a situation like the Kashmir Valley, where organisations like Amnesty International are very active, we are yet to see people held account for abuses of human rights. And so I thought it was appropriate to open up the whole question of evidence. Evidence is something that artists increasingly around the world are looking at. And of course, documentary filmmakers and photographers have grappled with this question for many years. And so I'd like to ask you, Sanjay, about this project, about the book. Do you see it having a role or a function as evidence?
Yeah, I think that the most important conversation that has finally begun around these the territory that you are asking us to step into is, you know, what is evidence and evidence of what? You know, in that sense, I think the broadening of the idea that it's not, you know, that report on mass graves or unidentified graves is absolutely valuable and valid. But that kind of evidence only reaches out to and affects a certain kind of person. Similarly, of what we in India have called fact-finding reports, and you know, Kashmir has seen many of those in these last 15 months, and they do give you a sense of what evidence is supposed to tell you. it leads you into a more substantial understanding. But there is a whole lot of this territory which just gets left behind and ignored, which is, I think, the territory that Cups of Noon Chai manages to enter, which is that what happens when you present that evidence in diverse contexts. So, for example, as she's pointed out, 60, 70 of those conversations are in Australia. What happens when somebody with, let's say, very minimal or no insight into Kashmir or understanding of Kashmir is drawn into the conversation? Then how do they respond to it? I think that response is valuable not just for other Australians or for an international audience, but it's also important for Kashmiris, to understand that the colonialism that they are confronting is a facet of contemporary life in many parts of the globe. So sometimes it's not that it helps to know that somebody else is suffering as much as I am or has suffered as much as we have, but also that in that sharing, so I think that what if we were to look at evidence as something which is not only directed at the old taxonomies, of numbers of dead, numbers of wounded. Those are very important. It really matters that we keep account of not just of every killing, but of every person who is blinded by pellet guns. I think that it's very important to do that. But sometimes you need a different kind of a different kind of excavation, of a different kind of fact, or in fact, let's not call them facts, let's call them feelings. That can there be an archive of feelings in that sense? And I think, to me, that's what Cups of Noon Chai does. It's not conventionally, it's not like this is an account of those 118 people who died in the summer and of 2010. No, but it's an archive of the feelings that their deaths created and the context out of which it's coming.
And Alana, your perception of the work and its relationship to the idea of evidence as a body of facts or information?
Yeah, well, the importance of reports and numbers that Sanjay has just said is, vital. And the list of names that we're looking at now has been provided by the Jammu Kashmir Coalition of Civil Society, which, do such important work within Kashmir. Thinking of evidence, like, I didn't make this work thinking of bringing together, facts or feelings or information in front of a court system, in a legal system, or as evidence like that. But it definitely felt like bringing this as evidence to people. And that was definitely something that I wanted to convey through the work. Yeah.
And before I wrap up, a general question. Alana, what are your hopes for the publication?
You know what? I'm quite curious. I think I've spoken a lot about how the work has kind of circulated and been received and collaborated with Kashmir. I'm quite curious about how it's going to move within India now. And yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing how that unfolds and that reception at the moment. I'm also just looking forward to people being able to kind of, I feel like through exhibitions or even through the newspapers or the websites, people sort of get fragmentary insights, or, they catch glimpses of the work. I'm looking forward to people being able to sort of see the work in its entirety in the book as well.
And Sanjay?
I think it's what I welcome and look forward to is that, you know, the beguiling, almost beguiling aspect of Alana's method, which I think that the book has been quite careful to hold, you know, and not transgress in that sense. I think that there is that aspect of just slipping in gently into a territory and being able to wrap up that cup of noon chai with an insight which is frequently profound and often quite incendiary. So I think that I as, not just as someone who's published the book, but just as someone who's interested in ways of telling stories, I look forward to how that this form, you know, I see it as an exercise in form. How will this form work, not just for the book, for all of us who are watching, to see like how how effective is this? Because ultimately that's what we are all engaged in. We're trying to communicate.
Bridie, could you now move us forward to the last slide? Well, everybody, on behalf of Alana and Sanjay and 4A, I'd now like to conclude. And before speaking about how it's possible to obtain the book, not only Cups of Noon Chai, but also Witness, I'd like to acknowledge the designers. And we've had some comments about the design in the chat. So I would like to acknowledge E2 Chowdhury Design, but there are also some writers, because writing is so central to the publication. There are additional contributions in the book by the Kashmiri journalist Pavai Bukhari, and also the poet Uzma Falak. More recently, on Alana's website, there is an online response to the book by Arif Aziz Hare. And we also need to acknowledge our supporters. So as Con mentioned, 4A Digital is being supported this evening by the City of Sydney. But over many, many years, gradually support has grown for this project. And we must at this point thank the Western Australian Department of Local Government, Sport and Cultural Industries for making a substantial contribution to the presentation of the book. If you would like to purchase the book, on this slide, you can see the website for the book. I'm delighted to say that it is also available in selected bookstores in Delhi, Srinagar, and Mumbai. And on the website, you'll be able to see details of those bookstores. And as well as our colleagues, Bridie Moran, Con Jerakaris from 4A, I'd also like to acknowledge Raina Takauchi, who isn't able to be with us this evening. We've had some really, really warm and appreciative comments over the chat. Some very, very considered questions, which has made facilitating this conversation a real pleasure. It's an urgent issue, but we have allowed ourselves a moment to dwell on the role of artists, the role of collaboration, the role of participation, and also the role of social engagement at a time when, on so many ways, we're really thinking about this whole question of what is the social. So thank you everybody for joining us. The conversation will be available as a recording, and I would urge you to return to the very first issue of 4A Papers and do look at that article by Alana, which is now part of Australian Hansard. So Sanjay, Alana, congratulations on the publication, and thank you everybody for launching the publication with us, and good evening.
And thank you to you, Jasmine, and thank you so much for everyone for joining us this evening and your comments and questions. It was wonderful to talk about it. Yeah.
Thank you very much. This was an absolute delight, Jasmine, and it sometimes seems incredible that the pandemic has forced us to evolve these ways in which we can have these, what I certainly felt was substantial conversation across the globe and connecting people from, it's mind-boggling. Something good has come out of this perfectly horrid year. Thank you very much.